You know, after 3 decades on this bench, I've developed a sixth sense for the people who walk through those double doors. I can tell, just by the way a person adjusts their collar or avoids my gaze, whether they are here to tell the truth or to spin a web of convenient lies. Most people come here because they want something that isn't theirs, or they refuse to pay for something that is. Greed is the most common language spoken in this courtroom, but every once in a long while, someone walks in who speaks a language I haven't heard in years, the language of pure, unadulterated integrity. On a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, a man named Samuel entered my courtroom. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a fancy briefcase. He was wearing a janitor's uniform that had seen better decades, faded, navy blue, crisp but frayed at the sleeves. His hands were calloused, the kind of hands that have spent 40 years scrubbing the floors that other people are too busy to look at. He stood with a posture that was strangely dignified, despite the weight of the world clearly resting on his shoulders. I looked at him, and then I looked at the woman sitting across from him. Her name was Mrs. Sterling. She was draped in cashmere, her fingers heavy with rings that cost more than Samuel probably made in 5 years. She looked at Samuel not as a human being, but as an inconvenience, a clerical error in her otherwise perfect life. The case was simple on paper: a lost envelope, $10,000 in cash, a man with nothing who found it, and a woman with everything who lost it. But as I sat there, looking at Samuel's face, a face etched with the lines of hard labor and quiet sacrifice, I realized this wasn't a legal dispute. This was a test of the soul. Most people believe that if you're poor, you're desperate. And if you're desperate, you're dangerous. They think that $10,000 in an unmarked envelope is a gift from God or a stroke of luck that justifies a lie. They think, she won't miss it, or I need it more. But as I looked at Samuel, I saw something in his eyes that defied that logic. I saw a man who knew exactly who he was, even if the rest of the world chose not to see him. "Mr. Higgins," I said, leaning forward, my glasses perched on the edge of my nose. "You found an envelope on the floor of the Eastside Medical Plaza at 11 p.m. You were alone. No cameras in that hallway, no witnesses. You opened it and saw $10,000. Tell me, what was the very first thought that went through your mind?" The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Sterling let out a small, impatient huff. But Samuel, he didn't blink. He looked me straight in the eye, a look of someone who has nothing to hide and everything to protect. "Before this is over, you will understand why I am telling you this story. You will see that the most valuable thing in this courtroom wasn't the $10,000 in that envelope. It was the legacy of a man who refused to be a thief, even when the world had already stolen so much from him. You are about to witness a verdict that doesn't just settle a debt, but restores a piece of your faith in what it means to be a human being. Picture a moment frozen in time. The clock has just struck 11 p.m. The hallways of the Eastside Medical Plaza are so silent you can hear the hum of your own heartbeat. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, skeletal shadows over the very floors that Samuel has spent a lifetime keeping spotless. He is exhausted, his back aches from a 10-hour shift, and in his pocket, he has exactly $4, just enough for the last bus ride home in the biting Chicago cold. And then he sees it, a plain white envelope, huddled lonely under a plastic waiting room chair. Samuel leans down. His knuckles, roughened and cracked from years of harsh cleaning chemicals, brush against the paper. It's thick, it's heavy. When he opens it under the dim hallway light, his breath hitches. Neatly stacked, crisp $100 bills, $10,000 in cash. For a man like Samuel, this isn't just paper. This is 2 years of rent. This is a used car so he doesn't have to walk through sub-zero temperatures. This is the medicine his wife needs, the prescriptions they've been rationing, penny by penny, month by month. There are no cameras in this corner, no witnesses, no one to stop him. In that moment, Samuel Higgins isn't just standing in a hallway. He is standing at the crossroads of his very soul. Now, look at the woman sitting across from him in this courtroom today, Mrs. Sterling. She sits there with the expression of someone who believes the world owes her everything, simply for existing. When I asked her about the money, she didn't speak of gratitude. She spoke of clerical incompetence and the delay in retrieval. She looks at Samuel as if he were a piece of the furniture, a nameless, faceless entity. "Mrs. Sterling, do you have any idea what Samuel did during the 30 minutes after he found that envelope? He didn't run for the exit. He didn't tuck it into his locker. He sat down on that same hard plastic chair, placed the envelope on his lap, And he waited. He waited because he thought someone might come back in a state of panic. He waited even though he knew he was missing the last bus home. Why does a man who has nothing protect the fortune of a woman who has everything? I look at Samuel. The deep lines around his eyes aren't from anxiety. They are the physical map of a man who has forged his integrity in the fires of poverty. Judge, Samuel says, his voice as steady as a mountain. I have been poor, but I have never been a thief. Money can buy you comfort, but it can never buy you a good night's sleep when you know you've done wrong. Mrs. Sterling lets out a sharp, cynical smirk, the kind of smirk I've seen 1,000 times from people who are rich in pockets but bankrupt in spirit. She cannot understand him, because in her world, everything has a price tag. But in Samuel's world, some things are priceless. The temperature in a courtroom doesn't always come from the air conditioning. Sometimes it comes from the sheer ice in a person's soul. As I turned my attention to Mrs. Sterling, I watched her adjust her pearl necklace with a gloved hand, a small, subconscious gesture of someone trying to shield themselves from a truth they find beneath them. Mrs. Sterling, I began, my voice dropping to that low, steady tone that usually makes dishonest people start to sweat. You claim this $10,000 was a minor withdrawal for a social function. You also claim that the loss of this money was due to, and I quote, the lack of security protocols at the medical plaza. But let's look at the facts. You didn't even realize the money was gone until 2 hours later when you were halfway through a 3-course lunch at the yacht club. I watched her face. I know the anatomy of arrogance. It's written in the way the chin tilts upward, the way the eyes refuse to acknowledge the person standing in the well of the court. To her, Samuel wasn't a hero. He was a complication. Mrs. Sterling, I continued, when Samuel found you, after waiting for hours, after missing his transportation, after guarding your fortune in the dark, you didn't offer him a seat. You didn't offer him a glass of water. You reached into your purse, pulled out a $20 bill, and told him to buy a nice broom. Is that correct? The gallery gasped. The sound was a sharp intake of breath, the collective shock of people who still believe in basic human decency. Mrs. Sterling didn't flinch. She looked at me and said, I believe in rewarding service, Judge. He did his job. His job? I barked, slamming my hand onto the bench. His job is to keep the floors clean, Mrs. Sterling. His job is not to be the guardian of your carelessness. He spent his own time, his own energy, and his own integrity protecting something that could have changed his life forever. And you treated him like a vending machine that gave you the right change. I turned my gaze back to Samuel. He was standing there, his head slightly bowed, but not out of shame. It was the posture of a man who was embarrassed for her. He looked at her fur coat and her expensive jewelry, and for the first time in that courtroom, it was clear who was truly impoverished. You see, Mrs. Sterling's cold dismissal wasn't just about the money. It was about the invisibility of the working class. She didn't see the man who saved her day. She saw a uniform. She saw a janitor. She failed to see the soul that was far more polished than the floors he scrubbed. I leaned back, removing my glasses and looking directly into the camera, into the eyes of everyone watching. We live in a world where we are taught to value the golden rule, but Mrs. Sterling follows a different one. He who has the gold makes the rules. Well, not in my courtroom. Here, the rules are written in character, and Mrs. Sterling is about to find out that her bank account is overdrawn in the only currency that matters. Mrs. Sterling, I leaned forward, the creak of my leather chair, the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence of the room. You testified that the money was for a charity function. You said it was destined for a foundation that helps people like Mr. Higgins. But I have your bank records right here. I tapped a manila folder on my bench. I didn't need to open it. I already knew the rot that was hidden inside. You didn't withdraw $10,000 for charity. You withdrew it to pay a private debt that your husband didn't know about. A debt incurred at a high-stakes casino 3 nights prior. You were desperate, Mrs. Sterling. You were frantic. And yet, you have the audacity to stand here and look down on a man who found your life raft and handed it back to you without taking a single penny for himself. I watched her face crumble. It wasn't the crumble of a repentant heart. It was the collapse of a mask. The charitable socialite vanished, and in her place sat a woman terrified of being seen for who she truly was. Arrogance is a sturdy shield, but it makes for a very brittle foundation. When you looked at Samuel that night, I continued, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel, you didn't see a human being. You saw a witness to your shame. You gave him $20 not to thank him, but to dismiss him. to keep him in his place so you wouldn't have to feel the crushing weight of being inferior to a man who earns in a year what you lose in an hour. I turned to Samuel. His hands were folded in front of him, resting on the wooden railing. They were steady. He wasn't gloating. There was no "I told you so" in his posture. Instead, there was a profound, quiet sadness. He looked at Mrs. Sterling, and he didn't see a powerful woman. He saw a captive of her own greed. "Samuel," I said softly, "did you know she was lying when she handed you that $20? Samuel looked up, his eyes clear and hauntingly honest. "I didn't know about the casino, Judge, but I knew the look in her eyes. It's the same look people give the trash can when it's full. They want the mess gone, but they don't want to know the person who has to carry it away." That sentence hit the courtroom like a physical blow. You could see the realization dawning on the faces in the gallery. We are so quick to judge the desperate poor, yet we ignore the starving rich, those who have everything in their pockets but nothing in their souls. Mrs. Sterling thought she could buy Samuel's silence with a $20 bill, forgetting that a man who cannot be bought is the most dangerous person in the room for a liar. I sat back, my eyes fixed on Mrs. Sterling. The anatomy of a lie was complete. The bones were exposed, the nerves were raw, and the verdict was no longer just about $10,000. It was about the price of a human soul. I looked at the $20 bill resting on my bench, the same bill Mrs. Sterling had tossed at Samuel as if he were a bothersome pigeon in the park. It looked small. It looked pathetic. But in this courtroom, that piece of paper had become a monument to the staggering arrogance of a woman who thought she could bargain with a man's dignity. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping into a register of quiet, dangerous calm, "I want you to look at Samuel's hands. Really look at them. They are stained with the chemicals used to clean the toilets you use. They are scarred from decades of picking up the messes that people like you leave behind. You handed him this $20 and told him to buy a nice broom. You thought you were being generous, but what you were actually doing was trying to reestablish a hierarchy that his honesty had just destroyed." Mrs. Sterling tried to shift in her seat, but her lawyer placed a firm hand on her arm. He knew. He could see the storm coming. "Arrogance is a luxury that expires the moment you enter a room governed by the truth. You see, Mrs. Sterling," I continued, "Samuel didn't return your money because he wanted a reward. He didn't return it because he expected a thank you. He returned it because he has an internal compass that doesn't fluctuate based on his bank balance. When you offered him this pittance, you weren't rewarding his honesty. You were insulting his humanity. You were trying to turn a monumental act of character into a simple transaction." I turned back to the gallery, and I saw a woman in the third row wiping her eyes. I saw a young man leaning forward, his jaw set in anger. This is the true height of human pride, when we realize that the people we look down upon are the ones holding the very foundation of our society together. "Samuel Higgins earns $18 an hour, I noted, looking back at my files. It would take him over 500 hours of scrubbing floors to earn what was in that envelope, 500 hours of backbreaking labor, and yet he didn't hesitate for 1 second. Meanwhile, you, who spend $10,000 on a weekend whim, couldn't find it in your heart to even offer him a seat. You treat your jewelry with more respect than you treat the people who serve you." I watched Mrs. Sterling's chin finally drop. The ice was starting to melt, but not into a pool of repentance, into a puddle of pure, unadulterated shame. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry that I was making her look at it. She was realizing that in this room, her cashmere was just rags, and Samuel's uniform was the finest silk. "The price of pride, Mrs. Sterling, is that it blinds you to the treasures right in front of you," I said, leaning back. "You had a chance to witness greatness in a janitor's uniform, and you chose to see a servant. That is a debt that no casino win can ever pay back." I watched as Mrs. Sterling's lawyer leaned in to whisper something in her ear. She pulled away, her face tight, still clutching her leather handbag as if it were a shield against the truth. She was waiting for the legal part to be over. She thought that if she just sat through my lecture, she could pay a fine, walk out those doors, and return to her world where people like Samuel are invisible. She was wrong. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice cold and sharp as a winter frost, "you've spent this entire morning acting as if you are the victim of a clerical error. But the only error here was your belief that you could treat a man's soul as if it were a line item in your budget. You didn't just lose $10,000 that night, you lost your dignity. And when Samuel Higgins handed that envelope back to you, He wasn't just giving you your money, he was giving you a chance to be a better person. A chance you threw away for the price of a $20 bill. I stood up from my bench. My knees groaned, a reminder of my own years of service. But I ignored them. I walked down the steps and stood on the courtroom floor, just a few feet away from Samuel and Mrs. Sterling. I wanted to be at eye level. I wanted Mrs. Sterling to see me not as a judge in a black robe, but as a witness to her character. Samuel, I said, turning to him, you told me that you waited at that medical center because you thought someone might be in a state of panic. You were thinking about her feelings. You were imagining the stress and the fear of the person who lost that money. You extended empathy to a stranger who, as it turns out, wouldn't even extend you a seat. Samuel nodded slowly. My father used to say, character is what you do when you think no one is looking, but God is staring right at you. I didn't do it for her, Judge. I did it for the man I see in the mirror every morning before I start my shift. The room went absolutely silent. That is the tu hoyt of true integrity. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need a reward. It is a self-sustaining flame. I turned back to Mrs. Sterling. You see the difference, Mrs. Sterling? Samuel is a free man. He can walk anywhere in this city with his head held high. But you? You are a prisoner. You are a prisoner of your own greed, your own lies, and your own crushing need to feel superior to others. You are sitting there in cashmere, but you are shivering in a coldness that no coat can warm. I looked at her lawyer. I am not just presiding over a dispute of a lost envelope today. I am presiding over a bankruptcy of the spirit. I reached out and picked up the $20 bill from the evidence table. I held it up so the entire gallery and the cameras could see it. This bill represents everything that is wrong with the way we treat the invisible people in our society, I declared. And today, the exchange rate is changing. Mrs. Sterling, you thought you were paying Samuel to go away. Instead, you've just paid for a front row seat to your own public reckoning. I took a breath, letting the weight of my words settle over Mrs. Sterling like a heavy fog. In this courtroom, silence isn't just a lack of noise. It's a vacuum where the truth finally gets room to breathe. I looked at the $10,000 envelope, then back at the woman who owned it, or rather, the woman who possessed it, because owning something implies you are worthy of it. Mrs. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the very back row, you came here today to claim your property. You wanted your money back. Well, you're going to get it. But the law doesn't just return what was lost. It accounts for the cost of the journey. Samuel Higgins spent 3 days of his life protecting your secrets. He spent his own meager funds to stay near that medical center, hoping you'd return. He lost wages, he lost sleep, and he was met with a $20 insult. I turned to Samuel. His face was a mask of quiet dignity, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands, the hands of a man who wasn't used to being the center of attention, a man who lived his life in the shadows so that others could walk in the light. Samuel, I said, Mrs. Sterling's foundation claims to support underserved youth and community heroes. It seems to me she has a massive surplus in her budget for things she doesn't value, and a massive deficit for the one thing she actually encountered, true honor. I looked back at Mrs. Sterling. The Ice Queen was beginning to crack. Her lawyer was staring at the floor, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at Samuel with disdain. She was looking at him with something that resembled fear. Not fear of jail, fear of the person she had become. Here is my judgment, I declared, the words ringing out like a bell. The $10,000 will be returned to you, Mrs. Sterling, because the law is blind to your character. However, this court finds that Samuel Higgins provided an extraordinary service of bailment and protection. In light of your own testimony regarding the life-changing importance of this money for your charity, and considering the gross negligence of your initial word, I am ordering a mandatory finder's fee and compensation for lost wages and emotional distress in the amount of $5,000. Mrs. Sterling gasped. $5,000? For a janitor? No, Mrs. Sterling, I snapped, the fire returning to my eyes. Not for a janitor, for a human being whose time and integrity are clearly worth far more than yours. If you can afford to lose $10,000 at a casino, you can afford to pay for the soul that saved you from ruin. And if you say one more word about his profession, I will hold you in contempt so fast your head will spin faster than a roulette wheel. I watched her checkbook come out. It was a slow, painful movement. Every stroke of the pen seemed to weigh a ton. She wasn't just writing a check. She was paying a tax on her own arrogance. And as Samuel stood there, tears finally welling in those honest, tired eyes, The turn of the tide was complete. The man who had $4 in his pocket was about to walk out with the respect of an entire city and a reward that would finally allow him to buy that medicine without counting pennies. I watched as the court officers escorted Mrs. Sterling toward the clerk's office to process the mandatory payment. She walked with a stiff gait, her eyes fixed on the floor, no longer the untouchable titan of the medical plaza, but a woman who had just been publicly weighed and found wanting. The cashmere didn't look so soft anymore. It looked heavy. I stepped down from my bench one last time and walked over to Samuel. He was still standing by the defense table, clutching a small, laminated card in his rough, calloused hands. It wasn't the check, Mrs. Sterling had just written. It was his library card. "Samuel," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's that for?" He looked down at the card, then back at me. "When I was waiting in that hallway, Judge, when I was sitting on that plastic chair with $10,000 in my lap, I pulled this out. I looked at the books I've borrowed, the stories of men who faced giants, the stories of people who lost everything but kept their souls. I told myself that if I kept that money, I could never walk into a library again. I couldn't sit among those books as an honest man. I felt a lump form in my throat, a rare occurrence for a woman who has seen the worst of humanity for 32 years. Samuel Higgins didn't just return an envelope. He defended the sanctuary of his own conscience. He chose a library card over a fortune because he knew that a quiet mind is worth more than a loud bank account. "Samuel," I whispered, "the world sees a janitor. But today, this courtroom saw a giant. You didn't just teach Mrs. Sterling a lesson. You reminded everyone watching that the golden rule isn't about the gold you have, it's about the gold you are." I turned directly to the camera, looking into the eyes of every person watching at home. We spend our lives chasing the next win, the next payout, the next thing that makes us feel powerful. But look at Samuel. He has nothing in his pockets, and yet he is the wealthiest man in this room. He can look his wife in the eye. He can sleep without a heavy heart. He can walk into that library and know he belongs among the heroes. To Mrs. Sterling and those like her, you can buy your way into the best clubs, but you cannot buy your way into the kingdom of self-respect. That is earned in the dark, in the quiet hallways, when no one is watching, and you choose to do the right thing simply because it is right. Samuel walked out of my courtroom that day with $5,000, but more importantly, he walked out with the one thing that Mrs. Sterling would spend the rest of her life trying to buy back: a legacy. What about you? What would you do in that dark hallway? Before you answer, look at your own library card. Look at the mirror, because in the end, we aren't remembered by the money we lost, we are remembered by the integrity we kept. Case closed.